But tonight, of course, we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Ambassador Lilley. He's going to talk on China and U.S. relations in the 21st century, the question of cooperation and competition on one hand, or confrontation on the other. Ambassador Lilley had a long career in public service. He was born in China, by the way, and was educated, of course, here in the United States, though, at Exeter and then at Yale. And I believe from the resume, although it doesn't sound it, it sounds like the Central Intelligence Agency for a period of time, especially in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Taiwan, Japan. And then after those, and let me read this if I may, he was appointed in 1975 as the National Intelligence Officer for China, the senior post in the intelligence community. In 1981, he served as political coordinator for senior East Asian specialist in the National Security Council. He was director of the American Institute in Taiwan from 82 to 84, and then consultant on national security affairs to the Department of Defense. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs, 85 to 86. He served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, 91 to 93, and as our ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 86 to 89, and the American ambassador to China from 89 to 91. He has written several books on China. He's not presently heading up the Asian Studies program at College Park, and does a similar role, serving in the Asian Studies program at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. Excuse me for the clumsiness of the introduction. I hadn't expected to do that this evening. But in any case, it's a marvelous career. He's one of the nation's foremost authorities on China. It's my great privilege to introduce to you Ambassador James Lilley.
I apologize for being late, but it was one heck of a drive from Washington, believe me. Took the Almighty to get me here, but that's a good sign. I'm going to talk to you about China tonight, focusing on China, not Korea, although I spent all day on Korea, because there's a crisis there too. There's a crisis in Indonesia too, there's a crisis in Iraq, but I am going to focus on the big enchilada, China. Secretary Cohen just made the comment in his trip to the Far East, Secretary of Defense Cohen, that security breeds stability. And that's what I'm going to start talking about. But before I indulge in that, I'm going to try to take advantage of my long exposure to China, approximately 70 years, and indulge in a few verities or eternal generalities. Because we Americans tend to fall into these traps sometimes, including yours truly. 5 of these I'd like to stress to you before I start talking about China. First is that great changes happen in China, but they happen the way a supertank turns. They happen slowly, usually. They move slowly. It can take years. The pace of change more recently has been rapid, from civil war in 1945, only 50 years ago, to Stalinist-type Russian communism, central planning, state-owned production, to years of madness, social engineering with Chinese characteristics, great leap forward. Millions of people died of starvation as the Chinese tried their own message. And finally, just 20 years ago, Deng Xiaoping, who died in February last year, instituted the reform program. But just to remind us that there's something eternal about this, I picked up a New York Times, yellow New York Times I had the other day, dated 14 November 1948. And the headline was to this respect: "What to do about China is a major U.S. problem. In view of the high strategic stakes involved, we must make important decisions." New York Times, November 1948. Perhaps Mr. Secretary Cohen felt that today when he went over to China. But first thing, change happens. It happens in gigantic form. It happens slowly. In the last 50 years, there has been more rapid change. Number two, to change China. Jonathan Spence, the professor at Yale, wrote the book, and he says, you arrogant foreigners have to realize there are limitations on how you can change China. You can have influence, but it never comes out quite the way you intended. And it started with Matteo Ricci, the Jesuit priest, in the 17th century, and it probably goes right today to Sandy Berger and the National Security Council. Be a little humble. You aren't going to change China. You aren't going to Christianize it. You aren't going to turn it into a communist utopia. Because if you look at the people that really tried to change China, the early Christians, Matteo Ricci, the people that came in the early 19th century, what happened is a young Chinese Hakka called Hung Xiuquan thought he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He was an epileptic. He got visions, and he led a huge revolt, and 20 million Chinese died in his perverted view of Christianity. Be careful what you introduce into China. The Russians thought they could do it in 1949 with Stalinism, Leninism. The Communist Party had won the Civil War. Marxist-Leninism came to China, and what did they get? They got the madness and social engineering of the Great Leap Forward, where perhaps 40 million Chinese died because the Chinese fooled with communes and backyard furnaces and to change the whole society. You introduce communism, you get the Great Leap Forward. So when you introduce free market forces into China today, 20 years ago, with Deng's reforms, what are you going to get? You're going to get Jeffersonian democracy? Hardly. You're going to get something more approaching socialism with Chinese characteristics. And we've all got to figure out what those Chinese characteristics are going to be. So, China can change. Foreigners have limitations on how they can change China. But number three, the Chinese are not pacifistic people. They fight. They fight wars a lot of the time. And they fight wars on their borders, and they fight with guns. They have developed a new strategy of limited high-technology warfare on their periphery. But if anybody believes they're peaceful people, ask the Koreans in 1950. I was there. Ask the Taiwan people in 1954 or 58. Ask the Indians in 1962. The South Vietnamese in 1974 in the Paracel Islands, the Russians in '69, and we sent 2 carriers off Taiwan in March 1996. So when you get involved with China, you have to be thinking somewhat about force, and that the Chinese use force as a logical extension of their policy. It has been manageable since 1996, but a combination of American bungling, Chinese overreaction, Taiwan mischievousness led to a volatile mix that almost got us into a shooting war. They were firing nuclear-capable missiles. We were sending in aircraft carrier battle groups. I think we have to understand, too, as number 4, that China is a rising, changing power, and we Americans are more, in some ways, a status quo power. We want to see Asia stay pretty much the way it is within the bounds that it has now. That isn't that America doesn't change, America does change. But we don't see any need to change the geographical limitations of countries. They do. They want to make sovereign changes. They are feeling their oats, almost like our 19th century imperialism. And this means that their interests intersect with ours in places like Korea, in places off Japan, Taiwan, South China Sea. We have interests there. They have claims. This need not be confrontational. Much of it can be cooperative and competitive, but it can go either way, depending on how you play it. The important thing, I think, that's emerged recently as the President Clinton and his staff have realized that what the Chinese really demand, and it might sound rather foolish and pompous, but what they want is symmetry, rituals, and respect. And you've got to take their president into the White House through the front door, not the back door, which was originally offered to him, with cross flags and 21-gun salute, the whole 9 yards, chandeliers, red carpets, banquets, toasts, etc., etc. That's part of the drill. It's Confucian. It's built into the Chinese character. We managed to do this in March this year, last year I guess it was, November last year. And they have gained some of this respect. And they've gone back and things have been better. Nixon knew this, Ford knew this, Carter knew this, Reagan knew this, Bush knew this, that to get along with China, you got to have these symbols, rituals, dinners, toasts. It's part of it. You don't just ask them to come down to see you. And finally, I think you have to recognize what concerns them, what really worries the Chinese. And what worries them, perhaps more than anything else, is the fear of chaos, the fear of disintegration, fragmentation of the country, civil war, and foreign control. But there's an added dimension there. They fear and have a psychological fear of inflation. I mean, some of you may be as old as I am and can remember in '49 those wheelbarrows full of $100 bills around Shanghai and executing gold merchants on the Burd. It's built into them that inflation can destroy the country. But more important, chaos. Stop chaos from happening and limit the foreign intervention. Yes, you invite investment in, you want trade, you want cooperation, but it's got to be under control. Their desires, on the other hand, their desires, positive. They want to be great. They deserve, they believe, to be a great country. They want to be respected, and they want to be unified. And also they want to get as much as they can in a very practical way. Take away from others what they think belongs to them. So, having given you these 5 points, let me just go to what I think is the key issue that we Americans have to address between the United States and China, because it is so misrepresented in our press, in our literature, in our books. And that is the military dimension of our relationship with China. It's perhaps not on your agenda very often, but it's been on my agenda a lot, having gone through Korea and elements of Vietnam, and been at the opening to China, seen it in its peaceful and in its warlike mode. I certainly prefer the peaceful approach. But until you get some form of security and balance with China, nothing will be stable. And therefore, you've got to start looking at what they've done and what they are doing and what they are trying to accomplish militarily. We fought 2 very bloody wars. We fought a war against Japan, and we fought a war in Korea. And if you want to add it on, we had a long and bitter war in Vietnam. And China was involved in 2, once on our side, once against us, and once as a surrogate supporter for Vietnam. It was a very unpleasant experience to fight them in Korea. It was an equally unpleasant experience to fight them through the Vietnamese in that particular situation. In World War II, it was deeply disillusioning because we were fighting with the wrong side, the side that lost. But Wilkenfeld and Blecher, and Wilkenfeld's at the University of Maryland with me, have toted up this thing, and they've come up with the conclusion that the Chinese do fight wars on their borders. Sovereignty is very important to them, and when they're challenged, they'll talk, but they'll also shoot. So you've got to be prepared for both. Again, there's that list of countries, starting with Korea in 50, Vietnam 74, Russia 69, India 62, Philippines 94. If it's not managed well, it can lead to a major disruption all over Asia. And what we have also is a certain philosophical difference on how you approach military matters. And you take a well-meaning, decent man, legal mind like Warren Christopher, our late Secretary of State, who felt that somehow transparency, if somehow we could lay out our plans on the table and they would lay out theirs like we did with the Russians and had checks on what they did, that this would somehow solve things. But the Chinese for 4,000 years have always felt that when you're capable, feign incapacity. Strategy is key. You've got to deceive your enemy on what you're doing. You've got to dissemble on your budget. You've got to dissemble on your purchases, on your research and development, on your tests. You don't tell them that. It's stupid from their point of view. If we choose to be transparent to them, that's our business. We're the strong one. But they have no obligation to be transparent to us because that's dumb. So you have a difference when you approach these things, and I think Americans have gone in there, our military men, I've talked to a number of them, Chief of Staff of the Army, Chief of Naval Operations, think PAC, as they've gone in, advise them what I think. And of course my first advice is don't expect too much because you're coming at them with a point of view to reach out to them, but they don't trust what you're doing. And they aren't about to tell you what they're doing. Go step by step. But as we look at this, and we get beyond this naivete that sometimes pervades what we Americans do, I think there are serious flashpoints we have to watch. And one of these is the South China Sea. Why the South China Sea? For a number of reasons. Because there's oil possibly there, there's a lot of fish there, and the key sea lanes of the world go through there that feed our allies in Japan and Korea and Taiwan and Philippines. It's not a minor thing, it's a major thing. And it seems to me that you've got to get the Chinese clear on this because they've claimed the whole thing in their National People's Law of 1992. They make no bones about it. They say the whole thing's theirs. And we said to them in 1994, say what you want in your bills, but don't interfere with the sea lanes, because those are critical to us. And in my presence, Admiral Larson, who was then Commandant of the Naval Academy, made this point. And 9 months later, the Pentagon made the same point. Say what you will about your sovereignty, that this stuff belongs to you, but you will not stop ships going through. And oddly enough, because we took this approach, I think in part, the Chinese said 3 weeks later, we never intended to block any ships going through. It just happens to belong to us, and we're allowing the ships to go through. That's the workable compromise. We're not taking a position on your sovereignty, just don't mess with the ships. I think that's manageable. I think the Taiwan situation has been dramatized. It has become the plaything of American dilettantes and Chinese warlords, and we've gotten caught in a miserable Tang war between Taiwan and China. It concerns us because Taiwan is a very vibrant place. It has 21 million people. It is a per capita income of over $10,000. It is a free and democratic state. It's not a very pretty one, but it's democratic, free press, opposition party. And we don't see something like that go under. It goes against our grain in Berlin, other places. And we have an arrangement with Taiwan, Taiwan Relations Act, where we say that relations between China and Taiwan are up to them, but they must be handled peacefully. And if they are not handled peacefully, there's an implicit statement, we're involved. And when Secretary Perry sent out the 2 carriers in March '96, I think the Chinese got the message. Don't tread on me. It's a foolish thing. You're strong, you're big, you're important. We hold out the hand of friendship with you, but don't do things like that. Don't fire nuclear-capable missiles. And if you get that nailed down, and you stop sort of experimenting with bringing the president of Taiwan over here to go to his alma mater at Cornell, which is perfectly legitimate and the right thing to do, but we handle it very badly in a way that provoked them. Just as an example, we told them beforehand that we would never allow him to come here, even as a private citizen, because that would be a violation of our 6 administrations' 2 China policy, or 1 China policy. And then we let him in and say, well, it wasn't a violation. And of course they get angry, they pull their ambassador, they start throwing tantrums, and you get into a mess. So you have to plot your moves very carefully. I'm not saying you buy their line on keeping Taiwan people out of here. I say invite them here, but do it right. Korea. Here's where we intersect, and here's where it could be the most deadly. Americans lost 55,000 men fighting for that country between 1950 and 53. It's a good country. It's a strong country. And I saw the absolute devastation of that country from the nose of a bomber looking down over the incredible devastation of South Korea inflicted on them by the North. I came back in '86 ambassador and saw this remarkable, miraculously built-up country. Right now, there's a few financial problems. We can get into them later if you wish. They've done a few things wrong. They sure have. And I spent all lunchtime with one of their new president's advisors hearing his version. And I'm going to go over there for the inauguration of the new president, who's an old friend, and work with them on this thing, because I think they're very good people, and I think America did exactly the right thing to go in there and stop the North Koreans from taking it over. But we paid a very heavy price. And traditionally, historically, this has been part of the Chinese sphere of influence. And they've got this obnoxious, Stalinist, failing regime in the North that can't feed its people, that has a huge, bloated army, has missiles, nuclear weapons, everything aimed right at us, and we're feeding them and building light water reactors for them. There's something dumb about that. It's where I disagree with our current policy, as you might suspect. But it's something that can be corrected, because you have a new president in South Korea who has the credentials to effect the economic changes you need in the South and really genuinely reach out towards these awful creatures in the North and coax them out of their clay caves into the civilized society. And I think we have a chance to do it, but I don't think you do it by giving them something for nothing. They don't know what you're doing, they don't understand it, and they think you're a bloody fool. That isn't the way they operate. If you give them something, you get something. All right, so they closed down 2 bumbling nuclear tiny plants, but they get $4 or $5 billion worth of nuclear power, which they haven't a clue in how to use. What they need to do is be fed and clothed and sheltered. They're at that primitive stage. But we've gotten talked into, and we're very decent people, Americans, and we're humanitarians. And none of us can resist when they see a starving child being held by Diane Sawyer to donate food, to feed them. And my friends come to me and do give food to the North Koreans. And I said, what food you're giving to that kid's food then goes to the army, who then aims its guns at us. In any case, I think we can manage this one. I think we can come out on top. We're very strong. We're on the right side of history. The Chinese are basically with us. They want a unified Korea. They want to reform North Korea, and they don't want war. Because if we lost 55,000 men in 1950-53, they lost 500,000. So they know the cost. They know who Matt Ridgway is and who Doug MacArthur is. So we have these problems, but again, I say manageable. It's very important that the U.S. be there to keep the peace in all these three areas, because if we weren't there, I think you'd see a tip in the balance of power and the Chinese would come into it. Because they are not romantics. If they see the opportunity, they'll take it. That has been the pattern since 1949 when they seized power. So we watch them carefully, and there is a whole school of thought in the United States which tries to tell you over and over again that they're really very backward and their budget is very small and they're way behind us and you can't really judge them because they only act to provocation. And there's a whole book written about this called Great Wall, Empty Fortress by two fine China scholars, but they've got it wrong. They've never served a day in the military, and they're writing about very military things based on Chinese traditional historic strategy, which they don't quite understand. On the other hand, you have a group of people running around saying the sky's falling. The Chinese are 10 feet tall, they've got intercontinental ballistic missiles, Russian submarines, and they're going to blow up Los Angeles if you misplay your hand on Taiwan. Nasty, bloody talk from Americans who have just written a book called The Coming Conflict with China by a New York Times correspondent, Richard Bernstein, and a former Toronto Globe and Mail man, Ross Monroe. So you have the debate on the military, a deadly serious business, being caricatured by one side, saying really they're going nowhere, don't worry about it, let's do business with them, let's sell them what they need, with certain self-interest in there. The other side saying they're monsters. They're monsters, and none of this, neither side is right. We know that the Chinese are deadly serious about us. They've written it all out in books, and this has been translated into English. They pay a lot of attention to the United States. We are the single superpower in the world, and what we do matters a great deal. I just had a Chinese seeing me 2 days ago, telling me about our containment policy, how we're trying to limit China's role in the world, and why don't you go home? Asia's not your home. You have the North American continent. That's where you belong. And you get that sort of argument thrown at you. And I said, well, we've been in Asia for a long, long time, and we'll be there long after you're gone, because we have a commitment there, and we've fought many wars over that place. We have a major involvement in these countries, measured by any measurement that you choose, whether it's cultural, financial, military. We are there and we are important. But we know that the Chinese look at us as the greatest impediment to their ambitions. I'm not saying that you're talking about Mein Kampf or some Stalinist imperialist desire. I'm talking about very shrewd and cunning people who look for vulnerabilities, and when they find them, move in on them. Very logical. Why not? If I was a Chinese military planner, I'd do it just that way. If they look at us and they look at the Gulf War, what do they see? What are we dependent upon? Satellites, the thing that shows us what happens on the ground. J-stars that support it. AWACS that support it. Stealth bombers to come in to bomb the targets, and the inevitable aircraft carriers. These three things: stealth, satellites, carriers. And what do? They very carefully plan to take out each of these systems, to put out your eyes and your satellites. There are weapons that can do this. To beat stealth, the Russians almost did, and to develop torpedoes with the help of their Russian friends that will sink a carrier. And they're working on it. They need enough power to keep their neighbors respectful and to get just about what they need and to negate the United States. I suppose, though, as one old wag said, hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays virtue, so that they continually insist that they are peaceful, non-aggressive, putting economics first, and repeat this mantra again and again and again. And there's an element of truth in it. But there's also the dark side. So I think on the military side, it's complicated. We engage them. We talk with them. We don't get very far. But they know that when they go beyond certain limits, we're there, and we won't like it, and we could very well do something about it that they won't like. And I think there you get an arrangement where you then shift your priorities from the military to what I'll talk about next is the economics. The free market is there not because they believe in it, but because they know it works. They don't necessarily think that Adam Smith is a great philosopher. They think that competition is better than socialism. And they've tried it in the last 20 years, and by God, it has worked. Look at what these people have done. It's amazing. 9, 10, 12% growth, rapid growing foreign reserves, exports up, favorable balance of trade, opening up all over foreign direct investment very high, and managing inflation beautifully. The great bugaboo of China is down to 0.8% in 1996. And that's what they've been able to do. And this is a real accomplishment of a regime that's got its eye on the ball. But don't think they're in love with you. They are not. I remember one old anecdote where one of their leading political leaders was talking to one of our prize economists who belched out all of this marvelous free market stuff very persuasively, very persuasively. He was one of our leading economists. And the Chinese leader looked at him as he told him about the free markets and price freedom and lifting up controls and deregularization and all this sort of thing. Yes, yes, this is very good. And then he says quietly in his native accent, this guy doesn't know anything that he's talking about. Yes, very nice, very nice. So be very careful when you're given the soft soap treatment, that he isn't saying to somebody in his own dialect that you can't understand, this guy's a little bit mixed up. Lead him on, but don't take him too seriously. It's not harmful, but I think it gets us into a position sometimes where we attach values to what they're saying to us that aren't really there. I think there's a number of things we have to work on with China, which we've worked on in various administrations, this one, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and we want to get them in the international system. We want them trading in Baltimore. We want them bringing their ships here. We want them investing here. We want Taiwan investing here and bringing their ships in. We want them in the act, and we want them to play by the international rules. Therefore, we want them in the World Trade Organization. But they're coming to us and saying, we're special. We need special rules. And we say, you aren't. You're going to play by our rules. And they said, well, we had nothing to do with making those rules. So why should we play by them? We said, tough, then you don't get in. But we're getting closer and closer with some very hard bargaining. And as we move in, we get out of this business of testing things by firing nuclear-capable missiles and getting down to the international law and how you deal with contracts that are broken. That sort of thing should be the essence of the relationship we have and where we should spend our time. And keep the large foreign direct investment flows going. They mess around with this. They increase tariffs on it. They try to draw you out on this, but they've lowered them when the foreign direct investments dropped. We see a pragmatism there in the late leadership that runs China. They're no longer dominated by a shortage base. We think of China as very poor. It is very poor. But the parts that we deal with largely are not that poor. And they aren't short of power in the way they used to be, or infrastructure, or other elements. They're getting it. They're getting telecommunications. And they're able to play off foreign consumers against each other. And they can use this game very effectively because we seek their market. It's very big, and you can remit your profits for the most part. But where we Americans really intersect with this country, I feel, it's why we're getting Maryland worked up on a major program, is to look at this very, very serious problem of how China feeds itself in the 21st century. We know that is number one on some of their own lists of problems, that population problem versus agricultural land. And when your population goes up at 15 million a year, and your land was shrinking at 1% as you went into industrialization, and you were importing 5-10 million tons of grain a year. There was an American called Lester Brown who said in the year 2020, 2030, they'll have to import 100 to 200 million tons to survive, and the world can't do it. You've got a huge problem that could explode all over the place on you, with 1.5 billion people starving. And it seems that now we are working with them to try to develop their productivity, to develop their understanding of market research, to get them into different products that sell in the outside world, to get their agriculture, their irrigation, and this terrible problem they have of water pollution. Because this industrialization has polluted so much of their water. And then they build this enormous dam on the Yangtze River. My God, the implications of that can be horrifying if they don't get it right. It's a real gamble. But they're moving in because they believe in great, grand symbols. Great Wall, Grand Canal, Three Gorges Dam. It's what pulls them all together as a nation. The Great Wall wasn't too effective in keeping the barbarians out. And I don't think the Three Gorges Dam will be very productive in cleaning up their pollution problem. But we do work with them on these things. And America has a great input, especially now as they try to go into the next step of dealing with the dinosaur and relics of socialism. They've got these gigantic factories built under the Soviets, before under the Japanese. They call them state-owned enterprises, and the productivity level is so low, and the over manpower and the over capacity and the shoddy goods they produce, they're stuck with this enormous monster that sucks up subsidies from the central government and keeps the rest of the country down, and they've decided wisely to tackle it, and they're going after it in a rather sensible, logical way. But at the heart of a lot of this lies the whole financial problems. Bad loans, political loans, also at the heart of the Indonesian and Korean problems. Loans made on a friendship basis and not on a commercial basis. You should see it in Korea. It was really something between the huge conglomerates and the government. This tight little group they had that put money and gave it to one or two men without any accountability, and they played with it. Car factories proliferated. Semiconductors were coming out their ears. They weren't doing these things on a commercial basis. They were doing it in some ways out of pride. But it had a magnificent manufacturing base. These people had really come a long way, but then the financial aspect had spun out of control, and this is where we Americans are very, very good. I just was down at a meeting of Morgan Stanley in Florida, and I've been up to talk to the Chase Manhattan people, and it's really impressive the international links that they have, the knowledge that they have, that is to be so useful to the Chinese in this very difficult phase when they're trying to privatize these awful dinosaurs that are relics of the socialist regime. And we belong there, and we should be helping them. But at the same time, we run smack into our own tendencies of human rights and humanitarianism. And my Lord, read about Chris Smith and his drive on Chinese abortion, or read about the persecution of Christians in China. There are a lot of things that aren't very pretty going on, and the exploitation of labor is ugly. And a lot of these people are contracted out to American corporations, and they work under perfectly ghastly conditions, as they do in other countries. But in China, it's on a much larger scale. And it's something where we have to be very conscious of our role in this thing. If we get into, let's say, labor-intensive manufacture for export, and they're working their people 60 hours a week and giving them $50 or $100 a month, and taking up their registration cards and putting them 12 in a room with one bathroom down the hall for maybe 200 people. The conditions aren't good, but they are competitive. And if you can get them to move out of this business of this labor exploitation it would be much better. And I think eventually we're going to run into a real problem. I don't think the Richard Gephardts of this world are going to let this thing go through when we start our debates on most favored nation again. And people are raising these things. How can you give them this sort of exporting license when they're doing this to their labor? They have no labor unions, they have no outlets, they have no opposition. Answer comes back. They are trying to change their system. It isn't going to look like us, but they're trying to change. They're having village elections. They are having opposition party people run. They are much freer than I was when I was there in 1973. Much greater mobility, change of jobs, a much greater limiting of the state sector, and much greater productivity in the private sector. All of these things are going on. So what I'm saying is that if you aren't prepared to deal with contradictions, don't get into China business. Because you'll see exports coming out that you love to put on your feet, and you'll see people working on these things. That's not very pretty. And you'll see other things happening in China, suppression of political dissent, religious persecution that turns us off, and we'll see people with a marvelous culture of poetry, art, history that many Americans admire tremendously. People ask me the hard question, is it going to break apart? No, it's not going to break apart. I've visited 27 provinces and cities in China. These people are going to stay together. Is it going to survive? Is it going to be able to handle 150 million unemployed? Is it going to be able to mobilize people from its state-owned enterprises when they cut numbers down to increase productivity? It's going to be very tough, and there's going to be unrest, just as there's going to be in Korea by the end of this year, with perhaps over 1 million unemployed in South Korea. We see across Asia the results of this financial manipulation. China has the same problem of corruption, bad loans, non-commercial. They don't know how to evaluate. That's where we come in. I think it's very important that we act there. Let me just finish on this note. I've gone through in a very, very rapid way some of the problems, and I'm sure you can think of many more. But I always ask people, watch for certain things when you look at China, when you pick up the paper, to give you an indication of what's happening. Watch and see if the Chinese put on more control on their prices, if they try to expand the state sector by getting control over prices. It's an indication of them moving, of the hardliners getting more control over the economy and pulling it somewhat back towards a socialist. Because there are people in China, very reactionary, that think that Mao and Stalin were still right. Believe it or not, they do. And they're strong, and they have large factions with them. You've got to watch and see if they really mean to forbid agricultural land being kept from being used for industrial purposes. Will they really carry this out? Will the agriculture give in to the expanding industry? And will they neglect the short-term problem of feeding their people because they can export a lot of stuff, import the grain, take care of the problem as their population grows and as their land shrinks? We have to watch that very carefully. I think you've got to watch this whole business of cronyism among greedy party cadre and entrepreneurs versus the rule of law. Is China going to move into a rule of law? There are people in China that want this and are trying to implement it, and there are people that don't want it and are trying to block it. That's a real struggle. How much does the rule of law operate? And I was told the other day by AES Power people that in their arbitration suits, it actually functions most of the time. And they say this is a far call from the way things were 10 years ago. There's good news there, but there's also a lot of bad news out there because it's done by cronies, connections, guanxi, whatever you want to call it. It's very important to them. See if they get into the World Trade Organization and play by the rules. Wu Yi, their minister, and Charlene Barshevsky, our USTR person, are very close to getting a deal. Watch that deal. See what it is. Does it really bring about the breaking of their monopoly over distribution of goods in China, which we insist upon? Does it really let us into their service industries and compete? We're somewhat insurance, you've got some banks, but does it really open up? Are they going to give us what they call national treatment? Do they treat us like they treat their own companies? Or do they put extra tariffs on us? These are things that we're fighting over with them right now to get into the World Trade Organization. I think we have to watch that. Watch Hong Kong. All of you, I'm sure, shared the drama of the turnover, with the Scotsman playing his bagpipes in the rain, and Chris Patton, the governor, and the very stiff-looking Chinese, and these goose-stepping soldiers. It was a mixed performance for us old China types. But things are not going as well as they'd hoped. The bottom has fallen out of the tourist trade. The real estate prices are starting to rocket downward. They're getting concerned about Hong Kong. The oddest thing is, Chris Patton was a British colonial governor, and if you'd had that chicken flu while he'd been out there with the chicken farmers the next day. The Chinese chief executive is in his air-conditioned officer making some pronouncement that things are all going to be all right. The conclusion for some of the Chinese in the biggest paper in Hong Kong is, bring back the British colonial governor. At least he was a man of the people. The ironies go beyond anything you can imagine. But this is the sort of thing that leaks out in Hong Kong now that they tolerate. How long will they tolerate it? How long will they tolerate this marvelous Emily Lau challenging them in the Legislative Council, saying your elections are a lot of phony things rigged by your party? You don't dare to have a decent election. What are you going to do about Emily? So far, so good. I think we've got to watch whether their strike levels increase. Do we really see that these exploited workers begin to get together? And we've seen incidents already of it happening. We've seen incidents of sabotage, strikes, blockages, various things like that. Does it get widespread? Probably not, because they'll keep it isolated. They know how to handle these things after Tiananmen. They learned some lessons. I think that you've got to watch if their National People's Congress, which is their legislature, actually begins to take a little power away from this party that they have, this Communist Party, which is their only real party, and which is growing in size because it's the engine of upward mobility. So you have a movement in China among people in the National People's Congress, which should represent the people, to elevate the level of village elections up to the county level, up to the province level, and begin to open up the process to accountability, secret ballot. And we Americans are helping them do it. We're over there working with them with their elections, and they're letting us do it, and they like it. A lot of people do. I think the old mandarins watch it with great suspicion, but the alternative is worse. If you put the lid on, it could explode. At least this gives the peasant a chance to throw out the rascal, the corrupt rascal, and he can do it. But you want to watch to see how their People's Congress goes. Do they raise the level of elections? Do they start reaching outwards towards Taiwan, South China Sea, and throwing their weight around, let's say, in the East China Sea with Japan? We watch that pretty carefully. It looks pretty good right now, actually. It doesn't look as though we're going to take that tack because they're focused on economics. But March 96 was less than 2 years ago, and we had 2 carriers just off the Taiwan east coast. It came close. I think you've always got to watch the regional pulls in China, the Cantonese, the Shanghainese, the people from North China, the people from Western China. Will they pull together, or will the pulls will the people on the east feel closer to Taiwan, the people south closer to Hong Kong? The center has to keep this under control, and it's no small task. It's a very tough one. But finally, I'll end on this thing. The movements that have taken place in China have been gigantic, from agriculture to industry, from rural to urban. Huge changes have taken place, and they seem to have hit, since about 1933, 93, a balance between growth, inflation, investment, etc. But they have these problems that they're saddled with, of huge bad debt, corruption, cronyism. And they know it, and they're facing up to it. But what the International Monetary Fund is doing in Asia, and I'm sure you've read about them all over the place, most recently in Indonesia, but you've seen them in Thailand, Malaysia, Korea, is they are changing the system that worked. We call them the little dragons, very proudly, 6 months ago. I can tell you IMF and the Korean Economic Institute were dead wrong on what was happening in Korea. You can look at their glowing reports. They didn't call it right. They didn't see the signs of corruption, bad loan that ate away the system. No regulation of the banking industry, that sort of thing, lack of transparency. It wrenches the society. It wrenches the society of Korea tremendously because you're changing the power equation. Indonesia, it's run by the Suharto family and the Liam overseas Chinese family. They call it the $30 billion nuclear family. And these decisions are not made on commercial basis necessarily. A lot of the deals they do make money, but the money goes into a very few pockets. And when the Indonesians get angry, they turn on the overseas Chinese. And that can be very, very bloody and unfortunate. And I think that's the last thing we'd like to see happen. But there are vast reactionary forces that resist change. And we've got to watch these forces very carefully and work with the moderate forces. We know who they are. And the leadership in China right now tends to move in that direction. And they've made the opening to us, and they do consider our relationship perhaps the most important relationship that they have. Not only in the sense that we curb what we might call hegemonism or adventurism, but that we are the key to the solution of their basic economic problems. And you shouldn't allow your military differences to get in the way of feeding and making your people more prosperous. I'll end on that note, and we'll throw it open to questions, if you'd like. Have I gone over time or under time?
No, we're in fair shape. Now,
Fair shape.
Now, normally we'd be ending about this time. Some
Okay.
of you I know have appointments.
Sure.
So we
I
won't
won't be-
consider it rude if you depart. However, we will have 10 minutes of questions now. Comment on the relations between
Russia.
China and
It's
Russia.
it's a very good question. It's very good because there are many aspects to this. The Russians, as you know, are bankrupt. And they've got this huge industrial military complex that creates tanks, missiles, guns, and they've been producing it for years, and now they've got a customer. And they've got a customer that wants their stuff. But it doesn't want the trash. It wants the high-tech stuff. It wants the torpedo that the Russians developed that came under a carrier like this, blew up, and the carrier breaks in half and sinks. Or they want to get the latest in Russian anti-satellite. Or they'd like to get, they have, as already, as you know, Sukhoi 27, which is equivalent to our F-15 fighter bomber, a very good airplane. And they've got the Kilo-class submarine, which is a good diesel sub. And they're looking for the Russians to solve all the problems we couldn't solve in nuclear propulsion, muffling the sound, in firing missiles, SLBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and all kinds of special metals they use in turbines that the Russians had that they didn't get. And they're getting a lot of this. And with technicians, and they're going into a new grade. We don't know the real dimensions of it. We think it's important because we see this reflected in their cruise missiles that they fired, for instance, in '96. And they had a pretty good show with their cruise missiles. And their short-range ballistic missiles were pretty good, too. That's one side. The other side of it is the commercial side. They're trying to get along. Russia is trying to sell them nuclear reactors. I don't see why anybody would ever buy a nuclear reactor from the Russians. But I took one of the Chinese leaders through one of our plants once, and he said, too much safety, too much overhead. You know, and the Russians don't have that problem. So they can undersell us, and they've just sold them a big nuclear. We're much better at it. They should be buying from us. And they are going to buy from us because we're the best. And they know we're the best. They'll pay more. And we had to hold back, as you know, for years and years because of this proliferation issue, because of what they were doing with Pakistan and Iran and Libya. And this was in our law, and we couldn't let them have this nuclear technology until we got this thing straightened out. And I think we finally did. And I hope that they can work out deals with the Russians. Their trade is going up, cross-border trade, Chinese selling largely consumer goods, buying from the Russians, heavy industry items. We hope they're peaceful. But I don't think anybody fears the relationship except for this sort of unhealthy cooperation on high technology weaponry. I think that's really the thing that worries us. It doesn't bother us that the Chinese are going into oil in Kazakhstan. They need the oil, and they signed a deal that actually we negotiated for the Kazakis. One of our lawyers did. And so it's very internationalized, and but the aspect that's troubling is the military aspect.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, we certainly thank you. We take a great deal of pride in our council audiences. This is I think, Baltimore's premier foreign policy audience, and today, because of the weather, you got to meet with the hardcore of the council's audience. It's been a marvelous evening.
I'm
we
amazed,
thank
and
you.
driving up that Baltimore-Washington Parkway, my Lord.
Must be splendid.
It's like climbing Everest.